Hello guys, today we'll be discussing about GDP at purchasing power parity. This term purchasing power parity we come across multiple times in our economics lessons when we are discussing about GDP, GDP per capita, and even when we discuss about exchange rates. So let's have a look at GDP at purchasing power parity. Probably by now you know the meaning of GDP. GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. So if it is GDP of Sri Lanka, we are measuring the total value of goods and services produced within Sri Lanka within a given period of time. So when we measure the total value of these goods and services, we take market prices of these goods and services. GDP per capita. What is the meaning of GDP per capita? GDP per capita means GDP per head. How do we calculate GDP per capita? GDP divided by population. So we have found here GDP per capita in New Zealand in 2019. How did we calculate this figure? By taking GDP of New Zealand and dividing it by the total population of New Zealand. Why GDP per capita is important? Because that is the standard measurement we use around the world to compare living standards of citizens. So if you take few countries and if you take GDP per capita for those countries, comparing GDP per capita, you can get an idea about living standards of citizens in these countries. For you to understand about GDP per capita and to get an idea about how to make a comparison, I gathered few information about GDP per capita in different regions of the world. This information is abstracted from World Bank website. This information is freely available, so if you wish, you can log into World Bank website and gather this information for free. So I found GDP per capita in European region, North American region, South Asian region, and Sub-Saharan African region. If you look at these four regions, the lowest GDP per capita is in Sub-Saharan African region. That shows the lowest living standards of citizens is in Sub-Saharan African countries, whereas the highest living standards are enjoyed by people in North American region. So if you look at South Asia, GDP per capita is $6,500. So this value is almost 1/10 of GDP per capita of North American region. So if you look at some countries in South Asia and some countries in North American region, there is a huge gap between living standards of people live in North America and South Asia because there is a huge gap between GDP per capita if you take North American region and South Asian region. But if you compare European area and North American region, it's not a huge gap. So if you compare these two regions, considering GDP per capita, North American citizens have higher living standards compared to European citizens because their GDP per capita is higher than Euro area GDP per capita. So if you consider these four examples I have taken here, you can get an idea. Using GDP per capita, we can compare living standards of citizens in different countries or different regions. We all know GDP is one important measurement when we are comparing economic performance between countries. Not only that, even when we compare living standards of people around the world, GDP per capita is important. Therefore, GDP is very important economic tool. But when we are calculating GDP in different countries around the world, we face a difficulty. If you take the GDP of United States, it's calculated in US dollars. And if you take the GDP of Sri Lanka, it's calculated in Sri Lankan Rupees. How can we overcome this problem if we want to compare GDP of United States against the GDP of Sri Lanka? Somebody can say use exchange rates. What is exchange rate? Exchange rate is the value of one currency in terms of another currency. So if you know value of 1 US dollar in terms of Sri Lankan Rupees, multiplying Sri Lankan GDP by $1 value, you can find out how much is the GDP of Sri Lanka in US dollars. This is a tough job, but if you look at exchange rates to convert GDPs of different countries and compare them, there are some drawbacks or there are some limitations. What are these limitations? Let's have a look at. The first difficulty we face, exchange rates fluctuate more often. So if you take value of Sri Lankan rupees against US dollar, it won't remain the same. Couple of months back, the value of Sri Lankan rupee against US dollar was 205 rupees. But by now, the value of Sri Lankan rupee has improved. As a result, 1 US dollar is like 195 rupees of Sri Lankan rupees. So you can see over the couple of months, exchange rate has fluctuates. So when we use exchange rate to compare GDP of two different countries, there is a tendency sometimes we can overestimate the value of GDP if the exchange rate is appreciating. And if exchange rate is depreciating, then we are underestimating the value of GDP. Not only that, we face another difficulty when using exchange rates to convert one GDP into another currency. Another problem we are facing using exchange rates to convert one country's GDP into another currency is about tradable goods and non-tradable services. If you take tradable goods, these are the goods which we can trade between countries, simply imports and exports. So, prices of tradable goods are always same in all the countries. If you buy a TV in the UK, there is a price, and this price is same as the price you have to pay when you're buying the same TV in Sri Lanka. But the story would become different when we move to non-tradable services. How to compare GDP between different countries? If you take GDP and if you compare it using exchange rates, now we know it's not a good idea because there are some mismatches when we are converting one country's GDP into a different currency. To overcome this problem, economists came up with an idea where they create a basket of goods comparable between countries. So if you take this basket of goods, they are going to compare the value of this basket in one country and the value of same goods in the basket in a different country. So purchasing power parity is the value of this same basket of goods in different countries. But how do we calculate it? Let's have a look at how to calculate purchasing power parity. For an example, let's think a Coke bottle is priced at 100 pence in the UK and the same Coke bottle is priced at $1.50 in the US. So the purchasing power parity is a ratio. How much is the purchasing power parity ratio? Is price in the US divided by price in the UK. So price in the US is 150 divided by price in the UK. Our answer is 1.50, which means a product priced at $1 in the UK is going to be priced 150 in the US. This is not same as the exchange rate between the United States dollar and British pound. If you look at the current exchange rate between US dollar and sterling pound, that is 1:0.71. So purchasing power parity is different from exchange rate. For you to get a better understanding about how the purchasing power parity works, I got another example that is called the Big Mac Index. Big Mac Index was invented somewhere around 1986. So this is used by economists to compare purchasing power parity between different countries. So if you look at base currency, we take the United States as the base currency. So we are going to compare the price of a Big Mac compared to the prices of Big Macs in the United States. So if you look at this graph, you can see price of a Big Mac is £329 in the UK, whereas the same Big Mac is priced $5.66 in the United States. So if we use this ratio, the exchange rate should be 0.58. But the actual exchange rate is different from this Big Mac index. The actual exchange rate between the United States dollar and the British pound is 0.74. According to the Big Mac index, our exchange rate is 0.58. If we look at the actual exchange rate, that is 0.74, which means the British pound is 22% undervalued against the US dollar when we compare the Big Mac prices. So try to understand purchasing power parity is a common currency we are using to compare prices between different countries. It's not same as exchange rates. I hope you have an understanding about what is meant by purchasing power parity. So when we are using the term purchasing power parity, that means we are using a common currency to make comparisons between countries. When we are using GDP per capita at PPP, means we are using a common currency to compare GDP per capita. And if we take GDP at PPP, which means we are using GDP at a common currency to compare economic performance. Just for you to understand how these nominal GDP, real GDP and GDP at purchasing power parity differ from each other, I gathered few statistics. This is nominal GDP, real GDP and GDP at purchasing power parity for the United Kingdom in 2019. You will be surprised, these three measurements give us three different values. If you look at nominal GDP in 2019, that means GDP of the United Kingdom at current prices of 2019. So what is the meaning of GDP at constant prices or else real GDP, which means GDP of the United Kingdom in 2019 compared to GDP in base year. So you can see there's a difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Usually, real GDP is less than the nominal GDP because we are using constant prices compared with a base year. If you look at GDP at purchasing power parity, if you measure the GDP of United Kingdom in 2019 using a common currency, that is somewhere around 2.8 million. So you can see GDP at purchasing power parity is higher than real GDP and real GDP is higher than nominal GDP. Out of these three measurements, we usually use nominal GDP to compare economic performance within a country. Using quarterly nominal GDP data, we can find out how well the economy is performing throughout the year. If you want to compare GDP of the country against previous years, you can use real GDP statistics. But if you want to compare economic performance of the country among other countries in the world, the most accurate measurement would be GDP at purchasing power parity. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do not forget to press the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe for upcoming videos. Our next video from this lesson, GDP, is about past paper questions. So I'll be discussing about MCQ and structured questions from GDP, real GDP, nominal GDP and GDP at purchasing power parity. Thank you for watching this video.